The colony of Epsilon Prime was a peaceful world, a place where families built homes under the twin suns, where children laughed in the streets, and where humanity had carved out a small piece of the galaxy for themselves. It had been decades since war had touched human colonies, and people had begun to believe that peace was permanent. That belief shattered the moment the first enemy warships arrived. It started with a deep hum, a strange vibration in the air that sent shivers down the spines of those who noticed it. Farmers in the outer settlements looked up, shielding their eyes from the midday sun. They saw strange shapes in the sky, dark, unnatural, blocking the light. Within minutes, the colony's planetary defense system came alive, alarms blaring across the city, warning everyone to take shelter. Governor Elias Carter stood in the command center, his hands gripping the edge of the console as red warning lights flashed across the screens. The sensors picked up dozens of unidentified ships entering orbit, then hundreds. His breath caught in his throat as the final count appeared. Over 10,000 enemy warships. It wasn't a raid. It was an extermination. "Open a channel," Carter ordered, his voice steady despite the cold fear in his chest. The comms officer's hands trembled as she activated the broadcast system. "Channel open, sir." Carter took a deep breath. "This is Governor Elias Carter of Epsilon Prime. This colony is a peaceful settlement. We have no military forces here. We request immediate communication to avoid unnecessary conflict." For several seconds, there was nothing but silence. Then, a voice crackled through the speakers, deep, mechanical, and filled with contempt. "There will be no negotiations." The screen flickered to life, revealing a monstrous figure, an alien warlord with cold, calculating eyes. The moment was brief. The transmission cut off, replaced by flashing red indicators on the colony's defense grid. The attack had begun. High above the planet, the first wave of energy beams rained down from the warships, cutting through the atmosphere like molten knives. Entire buildings vaporized in an instant. The city streets erupted into chaos. People screamed, running in every direction as massive explosions tore through homes, schools, and hospitals. A mother clutched her child, shielding him with her body as the shockwave from an explosion sent debris flying through the air. A doctor in the colony's main hospital desperately tried to move patients to safety, even as the walls around him cracked and crumbled. Soldiers, barely out of training, fired their rifles at the sky, knowing it was useless but refusing to go down without a fight. The colony's defense cannons roared to life, launching missiles and energy blasts toward the enemy ships, but it was like throwing stones at a hurricane. For every enemy fighter they took down, 100 more took its place. The planetary shield flickered under the sheer force of the bombardment, the generators struggling to hold. The people of Epsilon Prime had minutes, perhaps seconds, before the shield collapsed completely. In the command center, Governor Carter stared at the destruction on the screens. He turned to his officers, his voice firm despite the despair in his eyes. "Send a distress signal to Earth. Now." The comms officer's fingers flew over the console. "I'm trying, sir, but they're jamming our transmissions." Carter gritted his teeth. "Then we send it the old-fashioned way." He turned to his chief engineer. "Are there any scout ships in the hangar?" "2, sir, but they'll never make it past the blockade." "They have to try." Carter grabbed a data drive from the console and handed it to the engineer. "This contains all the sensor data on the attack. One of those ships has to reach Earth, no matter the cost." The engineer nodded grimly and ran from the room. Outside, the colony burned. The sky was filled with fire and smoke. Buildings collapsed, screams echoed through the streets, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with the sheer force of the orbital bombardment. In the hangar, a group of pilots prepared the last 2 scout ships. The engines roared to life as the ships lifted off the ground, their small frames darting through the chaos. The enemy noticed them immediately. Fighters broke off from the main attack, chasing the escaping ships like predators hunting prey. The first scout ship barely made it past the upper atmosphere before it was hit. A missile locked onto its engine, and in a flash of fire and twisted metal, it was gone. The second ship, piloted by a young officer named Lieutenant Sarah Hayes, weaved through the wreckage of burning buildings and falling debris, pushing the thrusters to their limit. The enemy fighters closed in, lasers flashing past her cockpit. A voice crackled over her headset. "Lieutenant Hayes, you have to make it." She gritted her teeth. "I know." The planet's gravity pulled at her ship as she made a desperate jump to hyperspace. The moment she vanished, the planetary shield finally gave out. The bombardment intensified, and within minutes, the colony of Epsilon Prime ceased to exist. The alien warlord stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the flames consume what remained of the human settlement. A cruel smile formed on his face. So fragile, so weak. He turned to his officers. "Send a message to their homeworld. Tell them what happened here." But he did not know that a single ship had escaped. He did not know that Earth would hear the screams of its people, and he could not know that, soon, humanity's answer would shake the galaxy itself. Lieutenant Sarah Hayes sat frozen in her cockpit, her hands gripping the controls so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The soft hum of the scout ship's hyperdrive filled the cramped cabin, but it did nothing to drown out the last moments of Epsilon Prime that still echoed in her ears. The screams, the explosions, the silence that followed. She blinked back tears, her breathing ragged, her heart pounding like a war drum in her chest. She had made it. She had escaped. But at what cost? She forced herself to focus. The data drive sat secured in the slot beside her, flashing green to confirm that the transmission logs and attack details were intact. She had one mission now: reach Earth, deliver the warning, and make sure the galaxy never forgot what had been done. A sudden jolt shook the ship. The navigation panel flickered. Alarms screamed in the small cockpit. Sarah's blood ran cold as she glanced at the screen. Multiple enemy signatures detected. They were following her. Her hands flew across the controls, adjusting the ship's trajectory, rerouting power to the engines. The scout ship wasn't built for combat. It had no weapons, barely any shielding, and was designed for stealth, not speed. If the enemy had managed to track her through hyperspace, she was already as good as dead. She bit her lip, forcing herself to stay calm. There was one way out: a blind jump. It was a maneuver that no sane pilot would attempt. Calculating a jump without coordinates could mean crashing into a star, an asteroid field, or worse, vanishing into the endless void of space. But Sarah didn't have a choice. If she stayed on her current trajectory, the enemy ships would intercept her before she reached the Sol system. Her fingers hovered over the controls for half a second before she made her decision. She rerouted power from the already struggling shields into the hyperdrive, maxing out the ship's acceleration. The engines roared in protest. The enemy ships were closing in, their weapons locking onto her position. Sarah exhaled sharply and slammed her hand down on the jump button. The stars around her twisted, stretched, and blurred as the scout ship was violently ripped through space. A deafening shockwave rattled the hull. The ship spiraled, alarms blaring, warning lights flashing. For a terrifying moment, she thought she had made a fatal mistake. The ship felt like it was tearing itself apart. Then, silence. Sarah gasped for breath as she checked the controls. The ship was intact, but barely. The hyperdrive was fried. Navigation was offline. Worst of all, she had no idea where she was. She took a shaky breath and activated the emergency beacon. "This is Lieutenant Sarah Hayes of the UEN Scout Division. My ship is damaged, hyperdrive offline. Requesting assistance. Please, someone, respond." Only static. She slammed a fist against the console, biting back a scream of frustration. She couldn't fail. Not now. She ran diagnostics on the ship's star maps, praying the systems could at least give her an idea of where she had landed. As the screen flickered to life, her breath caught in her throat. She was close. A mere 2 light years from Sol. Hope surged through her. She wasn't dead yet. If she could reach the Sol system, if she could reach Earth, The war would change. Humanity would know the truth. She fired up the emergency thrusters, setting course for home. It would take time, but she would make it. She had to. Deep in the heart of the Sol system, aboard the UEN Titan, a colossal warship stationed near Mars, Fleet Admiral Jonathan Mercer stood in the command center, listening to the grim reports coming in. The colony was gone, completely wiped out. No survivors, no transmissions, just silence. The weight of the loss settled over the entire room. The officers sat in stunned silence, their faces pale, their expressions unreadable. Mercer's jaw tightened, his fists clenched at his sides. For decades, humanity had avoided war on this scale. They had always believed that diplomacy could prevent another extinction-level conflict. But this wasn't war. This was genocide. He turned to his communications officer, his voice sharp. "Has any vessel returned from Epsilon Prime?" The officer shook his head, hesitating. "No, sir, but we just received a distress beacon. An emergency transmission. Unknown ship near the system's edge." Mercer's eyes narrowed. "Patch it through. Now." The screen flickered. Static filled the room. Then a voice, weak, strained, but unmistakably human. "This is Lieutenant Sarah Hayes. Epsilon Prime has been destroyed. They killed everyone. I have the data. Humanity must respond." The room went dead silent. Then Mercer turned, his expression cold and unreadable. His next words sent a shiver down the spine of everyone in the room. "Ready the fleet." The command center of the UEN Titan was alive with tension. The moment Sarah Hayes' transmission ended, orders were issued, fleet movements were adjusted, and the once quiet war machine of humanity roared to life. Fleet Admiral Jonathan Mercer stood at the center of the chaos, his eyes locked on the tactical display. A holomap of the Sol system flickered in front of him, but his mind was already beyond the borders of human-controlled space. Epsilon Prime was gone. An entire colony, millions of men, women, and children, erased from existence. And for what? A show of power? A warning? If it was meant to frighten humanity, it had failed. Instead, it had awakened something far worse. The United Earth Navy had been at peace for nearly 2 decades. Its warships had patrolled the edges of colonized space, acting more as deterrents than weapons of war. But humanity had not forgotten its past. The galaxy had assumed Earth had grown soft, weak. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Mercer's voice was cold, commanding. "Prepare Armada 7 for full mobilization. Every battleship, every carrier, every warship in active service. I want them ready to deploy within the hour." An officer hesitated. "Sir, with respect, we're talking about 700,000 warships. Deploying the full force of the Armada is." Mercer's gaze snapped to him, silencing the officer instantly. "This isn't a negotiation," Mercer said, his voice low but firm. "This isn't a border dispute or a skirmish. This is genocide, and we are not going to sit back and let it happen again." The officer swallowed hard, then nodded. "Understood, sir." The command center erupted into movement. Orders were relayed. Shipyards activated emergency protocols, and across the Sol system, the largest fleet humanity had ever assembled began its final preparations for war. Far beyond the orbit of Mars, Sarah Hayes drifted in the dark void of space. Her scout ship's thrusters had finally failed, leaving her stranded just outside Earth's defensive perimeter. The ship's power flickered, the emergency beacon still transmitting in intervals, but she was losing oxygen fast. The exhaustion was setting in, her body growing heavier, her mind fogging. Then suddenly, a shadow passed over her cockpit. A deep vibration hummed through the ship as something enormous approached. Through the viewport, she saw a colossal warship emerge from the blackness, its hull marked with the emblem of the UEN, the Titan. A transmission crackled through her dying speakers. "Lieutenant Hayes, this is the UEN Titan. We have you in our sights. Stand by for retrieval." Relief crashed over her like a tidal wave. She had made it. Moments later, the scout ship's cockpit was filled with flashing lights as a tractor beam locked onto her. She felt the ship jolt as it was pulled toward the docking bay, and for the first time since Epsilon Prime's destruction, she allowed herself to breathe. As soon as the airlock opened, medical personnel rushed in, unstrapping her from the pilot's seat and checking her vitals. She barely heard their voices, barely registered the concerned faces hovering over her. Then a familiar voice cut through the haze. "Lieutenant Hayes." Sarah turned her head, her vision still blurry. Admiral Mercer stood before her, his expression unreadable, his uniform pristine despite the storm brewing around them. She swallowed, forcing herself to sit up despite the dizziness. "Sir, the colony. I have the data." Mercer gave a single nod. "I know." He gestured to a nearby officer. "Take her to the briefing room. She's coming with me." The medics hesitated. "Sir, she needs." Mercer's tone left no room for argument. "She needs to be there." Sarah felt the weight of his words, the gravity of the moment. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was the last witness. And soon, the entire galaxy would hear what she had to say. 30 minutes later, Sarah sat in a war room surrounded by Earth's most powerful military commanders. The room was filled with holo-displays, tactical maps, and the rhythmic tapping of fingers on data consoles. She could feel the tension in the air. They were waiting for her. Mercer stood beside her as she inserted the data drive into the central console. The room dimmed as a massive holographic projection flickered to life. The images were horrific. Satellite footage of Epsilon Prime burning, warships descending like predators, streets filled with panicked civilians before they were vaporized in a storm of energy blasts, the final moments of the planetary shield before it collapsed. A heavy silence filled the room. Even the most hardened commanders looked shaken. Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat. "I don't know who they are. They didn't send demands. They didn't ask for surrender." She clenched her fists. "They just wiped us out." One of the generals exhaled sharply. This wasn't just an attack. This was a message. Mercer's expression hardened. "Then let's send them one in return." He turned to his officers. "Deploy Armada 7 immediately, every fleet in the system. We will find them. And we will answer for what they've done." Another officer hesitated. "Sir, the UN Council might push back on this." Mercer's eyes burned with fury. "Then they can watch while we burn their enemies to ash." The order was given. Across the Sol system, thousands of warships activated their engines. Weapons were armed, shields powered, and entire fleets moved into formation. Humanity was no longer on the defensive. They were going to war. The vastness of space trembled as 700,000 warships assembled at the edge of the Sol system. From the smallest frigates to the titanic dreadnoughts, every vessel in Armada 7 was now powered, armed, and ready for war. It was a sight unseen in human history, an entire armada moving as one, a machine of vengeance fueled by loss, rage, and a promise that Epsilon Prime would be avenged. Aboard the UN Titan, Fleet Admiral Jonathan Mercer stood on the command deck, eyes locked on the holographic war map. The enemy had yet to be identified, but Sarah Hayes' data provided a starting point, the last known trajectory of the invading fleet. The unknown warships had left behind energy signatures, traces of a hyperlane path leading deep into unexplored space. That was their destination. Humanity wouldn't wait to be attacked again. Mercer's voice was calm, but carried the weight of a storm. "All fleets, engage final jump preparations. We move on my command." Across the fleet, officers relayed orders, captains made their final system checks, and crews braced themselves for what was to come. The war to reclaim justice had begun. Sarah Hayes sat in the Titan's war room, staring at the holo-display of the enemy fleet's trajectory. The faces of the commanders around her were stone cold, their eyes fixed on the same thing. A deep sector of space. No known colonies. No records of trade routes. Just a void on the star maps. One of the officers frowned. Whatever's there, it's hidden for a reason. Sarah nodded. They wiped out Epsilon Prime like it was nothing. That means one of two things. Either it was a message, or they see us as an obstacle in their plans. Mercer's voice cut through the silence. It doesn't matter why they did it. What matters is that we find them before they do it again. He turned to the navigation officer. Calculate the fleet's jump sequence. We'll advance in 3 staggered waves. No surprises. No risks. The officer nodded. Understood, sir. Sarah clenched her fists. Even now, she could still hear the screams of the people of Epsilon Prime. The images of the colony's destruction were burned into her mind. But she wouldn't let herself drown in the memories. She was here, alive, because humanity needed to know what happened. And now, they were answering in full force. Within minutes, the order was given. Space itself twisted and groaned as thousands of warships activated their hyperdrives. The stars blurred, gravity warped, and just like that, humanity vanished from the Sol system. They reappeared seconds later in the unknown sector, and what they found made every officer on the bridge go silent. Before them was a colossal enemy fleet. Thousands, no, millions of warships. But it wasn't just the number that sent shivers through the UEN's commanders. It was what lay beyond them. A planet-sized war station. A massive artificial construct hanging in space like a god of war. Its surface was layered with gun turrets, hangars, and dozens of shipyards assembling more warships by the hour. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just an invasion force. It was an empire preparing for total conquest. Mercer's expression darkened. All ships, battle formations. The enemy fleet began to move, their warships shifting into attack patterns. Energy signatures surged, shields powered up, and weapons began locking onto targets. A message suddenly crackled through the comms. A deep, alien voice, cold and emotionless. You should not have come here, humans. Mercer exhaled slowly, then gave his final order. Fire. And just like that, the war truly began. The void of space erupted in fire and fury. Humanity's 700,000 warships surged forward, their weapons roaring to life in a synchronized storm of destruction. The opening volley struck like a hammer. Millions of railgun rounds, plasma lances, and antimatter warheads tore into the enemy fleet before they could fully react. Explosions blossomed across the battlefield as entire squadrons of enemy warships were reduced to debris. But the opposing fleet, despite the surprise attack, did not waver. Their ships moved with terrifying precision, returning fire immediately. Energy beams, kinetic slugs, and fusion warheads streaked toward the UEN forces. Human shields flared, absorbing the brunt of the assault, but the sheer number of projectiles overwhelmed some vessels. The first human warship, a heavy cruiser, shattered under the enemy's retaliation. On the bridge of the UEN Titan, Fleet Admiral Jonathan Mercer stood firm, his expression unreadable as the battle unfolded. Holographic projections showed the battlefield in real time. Thousands of ship markers blinking red and blue, the front lines shifting as both sides clashed. Maintain formation, Mercer commanded. Keep the pressure on their flanks. We can't let them regroup. Destroyers and cruisers maneuvered into position, cutting off the enemy's movements while dreadnoughts unleashed devastating broadsides. Human fighter squadrons weaved through the chaos, dogfighting alien interceptors and launching torpedoes at enemy capital ships. But despite their fierce assault, the enemy fleet was far larger than expected. The planet-sized war station loomed in the distance, its shipyards continuously releasing fresh waves of warships. Sarah Hayes, watching from her station aboard the Titan, gritted her teeth. They're endless, she muttered. Mercer's eyes flickered to the war station. Then we cut off their supply. He turned to the weapons officer. How long until the supermass driver is ready? The officer checked the system readouts. Capacitors charging, sir. We need 3 minutes. They didn't have 3 minutes. The enemy flagship, a monstrous vessel 3 times the size of the Titan, began moving directly toward them. Its hull was plated with an unknown alloy, its weapons already charging with enough energy to wipe out a fleet in a single blast. Sarah's blood went cold. The alien voice returned, resonating through the Titan's bridge. "Foolish humans, you should have stayed in your cradle." A bright light surged from the enemy flagship's core, an energy surge so massive that even from this distance, it blinded the view screens. It was a planet-killer weapon, and it was aimed directly at the UN Titan. For the first time in the battle, Mercer's hands tightened on the command rail. His voice remained calm, but the weight in his tone was unmistakable. "All power to shields." The enemy weapon fired. A beam of pure annihilation screamed through space, cutting across the battlefield like the wrath of a god. Every human warship in its path was instantly vaporized. Shields shattered, hulls disintegrated, nothing remained but ionized gas. And then it struck the Titan. The shields collapsed instantly. The ship's armor melted under the impact. The entire superstructure groaned, emergency klaxons blaring as half the vessel's systems shut down from the sheer force of the blast. Sarah was thrown from her seat, the impact rattling every bone in her body. Sparks rained from the ceiling, smoke filled the air, and for a horrifying moment, it felt like the ship was about to be torn in half. Then, silence. The Titan was still intact. Barely. Sarah coughed, her lungs burning as she pulled herself up. The bridge was in chaos. Officers scrambling to restore systems, medics rushing to aid the wounded. The entire port side of the ship was gone, replaced by a twisted mess of molten metal and exposed bulkheads. Mercer stood, his face illuminated by flickering emergency lights. He was still alive. And despite the damage, despite the devastation, his expression didn't change. He turned toward the battlefield. The enemy flagship was already charging for another shot. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. They wouldn't survive a second hit. But Mercer wasn't looking at the enemy flagship. He was staring at the supermass driver's charge indicator. 5 seconds left. The enemy didn't realize it. They thought the Titan was crippled, that humanity's will had broken. They were wrong. The charge indicator blinked green. Mercer's voice was cold as steel. "Fire." The supermass driver unleashed its payload, a projectile the size of a skyscraper, moving at relativistic speeds. There was no explosion, no fiery blast. The enemy flagship simply ceased to exist. One moment, it was there. The next, it was a trail of glowing debris, its atoms scattered across the void. The battlefield froze. For the first time, the enemy fleet hesitated. Sarah exhaled, her chest rising and falling rapidly. "We just killed their command ship." Mercer's eyes didn't waver. "Good. Now let's finish the job." The Titan's engines roared back to life, and across the battlefield, human warships surged forward. The tide had turned. The battlefield was a graveyard of shattered warships, burning wreckage drifting through the void. Humanity's fleet pressed forward, their momentum now unstoppable. What had begun as a desperate battle for survival had turned into a ruthless counteroffensive. The enemy fleet, once confident in their overwhelming numbers, was in disarray. With their command ship obliterated, coordination among their forces crumbled. Battleships drifted without clear orders, squadrons scattered, and their defensive lines collapsed. Fleet Admiral Jonathan Mercer stood at the center of the UN Titan's battered bridge, his face illuminated by flickering holodisplays. His ship was heavily damaged, shields barely functional, but it was still in the fight. And now, the true target remained. The planet-sized war station. A monstrosity built for conquest, its shipyard still spitting out new warships, desperately trying to replenish the enemy's forces. But they were too late. The war had already been decided. Mercer turned to his weapons officer. "Status on the Titan's forward rail cannons." The officer shook his head. "Partially operational. But, sir, it won't be enough." The war station's armor was several kilometers thick, reinforced with energy shielding that had already shrugged off several missile barrages. Conventional weapons wouldn't break through in time. Sarah Hayes, her face still streaked with soot from the earlier blast, studied the tactical display. "Then we take the fight inside." Mercer turned to her. "You're suggesting a boarding action." She nodded. "We disable the main reactor from within. If we shut it down, their entire station goes dark, including the shipyards and their heavy cannons." It was insane. It was also their best chance. Mercer didn't hesitate. "Prepare the assault teams." Within minutes, hundreds of boarding ships launched. Gunships and drop pods pierced through the enemy's outer defenses, evading flak fire as they punched into the war station's hull. Explosive decompression tore through the corridors as hundreds of human Marines stormed inside, weapons blazing. Sarah led the first wave. Her pulse rifle was already scorching hot from the number of enemy troops she had dropped. The station's corridors were filled with alien defenders, but they weren't prepared for the brutality of human close-quarters combat. Grenades tore apart defensive positions. Shotguns barked in confined spaces. Humans fought with the fury of a species that had been wronged. There was no retreat, no surrender. The battle raged through the station's interior, blood and metal coating the walls. Step by step, the Marines fought their way toward the reactor core. Sarah's team breached the final chamber, a massive, cathedral-like space housing the enemy's primary reactor. The core pulsed with raw energy, powering the entire war machine that had slaughtered Epsilon Prime. She wasted no time. "Plant the charges." Explosives were placed along the reactor's coolant lines and energy regulators. The enemy forces threw everything they had to stop them, but they were too late. Sarah pressed the detonator. A moment of silence. Then a blinding shockwave tore through the station. The main reactor collapsed inward, fire consuming entire sections as chain reactions ripped the station apart from within. From the outside, the human fleet watched in awe as the massive construct began to break apart. Entire shipyards collapsed, docking bays erupted, and the remaining enemy warships scrambled to escape. They had done it. The station was falling. On the UN Titan, Mercer watched the final destruction unfold. The enemy's war machine, gone. Their fleet was already in full retreat. What few ships remained fleeing into the void. It was over. Humanity had won. Sarah and the remaining Marines exfiltrated just in time, their boarding craft escaping as the station detonated behind them. The flames of its destruction lit up the void like a second sun. Sarah collapsed into her seat, breathing heavily as she watched from the cockpit window. Epsilon Prime had been avenged, but she knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. Mercer turned to his officers. "Mark this day. Let the galaxy remember it." His voice was cold. "Humanity does not forgive, and we never forget."